Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Neighbourhood First series organized by the India International Centre, New Delhi. This is the third topic of the series in the neighborhood, and the topic is the Afghanistan peace process. The last two countries that we covered in these series were Sri Lanka and Nepal. Let me outline the sequence of events and the format today. I will introduce the subject. This will be followed by the first speaker, who will be Ambassador Mahmoud Saikal from Afghanistan, followed by Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who was ambassador there, and then General Ashok K Mehta, that's me. Each speaker had got about 10 to 12 minutes to speak. This will be followed by a Q&A, starting with questions from the moderator, that again is me. Then there will be questions from the audience, and at the end, I will wrap up the event. In the nearly 3 decade long war in Afghanistan, finally, an institutionalized peace process has been hammered out between Kabul and Taliban through an agreement between the US and Taliban. Taliban, as we all know, and some of its affiliates are a UN proscribed terrorist entities. US has made exceptional concessions to the Taliban without securing a ceasefire, which is part of a final and political settlement. The Afghanistan peace process, even before it has started, is turning out to be the most violent in the history of conflict resolution. Fighting while talking and vice versa is an accepted norm for some of the peace processes, though a ceasefire is usually the primary condition for starting the process of negotiations. The Afghan peace process, the peace deal was signed on 29th February, and the face-to-face talks started on 12th September, but the peace process, I think, is still grounded. To discuss its trajectory, the likely end state, and India's role in it, are three panelists of exceptional experience in Afghanistan. Uh, the first speaker is Ambassador Mahmoud Saikal. Ambassador Mahmoud Saikal has been the Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, Ambassador to Australia, and Ambassador to the United Nations. In addition, he is the chair, or has been the chair, of the 73rd United Nations General Assembly Third Committee, and is currently the chair of the Kabul Association of Integrity. Over to you, Ambassador Saikal, to start the Afghanistan peace process. Ambassador Saikal.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me thank India International Center for organizing this timely webinar on the Afghanistan peace process. And let me extend my greetings to our old friends, Ambassador Rakesh Sood and also Major General Ashok Mehta. At the outset, I would like to highlight the human tragedy. 42 years of violent politics, foreign meddling, invasions, and proxy wars have badly damaged the social fabric of Afghanistan. The country has seen millions dead, millions disabled, millions of IDPs, millions of refugees, and millions being scattered around the world, most of them living a traumatized life. We still lose dozens and dozens of our nationals on a daily basis through terrorist attacks, bombings, and shellings. Afghanistan is now classified as the least safe country in the world. But despite these tragedies, we've had some major gains since we toppled the Taliban regime in late 2001. Between 2002 and 2006, Afghanistan turned into a symbol of international cooperation, with friends and foes working for the stability and development of the country. Those were the most peaceful years in the past 42 years. All we thought about in those days was development. Security wasn't a big issue. In 2006, Ambassador Sood and I, when I was the then Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister, we co-chaired the steering committee of the Regional Economic Cooperation Conferences on Afghanistan, known as RECA process, which later, the conference of which happened in New Delhi. Afghanistan has opened up after 20 years. It's opened up to the world through better communication, connectivity, infrastructure, health and education systems, civil and political rights, human capital, etc. India has been part of our success stories through development assistance to the tune of $3 billion in different vital fields. It is important to protect these gains. Challenges. The key challenges since 2006 has been the return of the Taliban violence and its rapid escalation in the later years. We also saw signs of regional discomfort with the presence of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Beside the RECA process, we initiated the Heart of Asia Istanbul process with a focus on regional political cooperation and security. Both Afghan-led processes were expected to pave the way for peaceful departure of the international forces and happy coexistence of Afghanistan with the region. International attention was given to the strengthening of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or ANDSF, and withdrawal of US and NATO forces. The NATO Lisbon Summit of 2010 agreed on a roadmap for withdrawal, under which by the end of 2014, the international forces came down from 140,000 to only 10,000. And even that 10,000 was going to leave by the end of 2016. Parallel to the security transition, we were going through political and economic transitions, so the functionality of the state was tested through three transitions at once. Politically, we faced an inconclusive fraudulent second-round election in 2014, resulting in the formation of a national unity government. A first in our history, but it slowed down governance and it did avoid a big crisis. With the withdrawal of international forces, the economy of war shrank by 80 to 90%, leaving a huge vacuum in the Afghan economy, and we saw a dramatic rise in poverty and unemployment. Meanwhile, Taliban's violence further escalated, forcing the Afghan government and the international community to rethink about the security and stability of the country. NATO launched the Non-Combat Resolute Support Mission to train, advise, and assist the Afghan security forces. It was clear that the Taliban foreign withdrawal was simply an excuse. It was clear that to the Taliban, foreign withdrawal was simply an excuse, and to some extent it was the demand of some of the countries of the region as well. Otherwise, with a dramatic decrease in the number of US troops in Afghanistan, the level of violence should have gone down. So why the coming back of the Taliban violence, and what do they want? Is the Taliban an indigenous movement? Yes and no. Yes, traditionally, we do know them as conservative religious assistants or students to the imams in the local mosques. They were peaceful and they were gentle. No, their politicization, militarization, and violence are not indigenous. While they were originally crafted by a particular country in the region, they have been part of regional and global games for some years now, which require a top level of coordination of interests. So far, on the surface, their political demands have been the withdrawal of foreign forces and pure Islamic government. What is their definition of pure? Not very clear. So you can easily tell that the Taliban is used for weakening Afghanistan through war or peace. Nothing to show that by bringing Taliban on board, we will strengthen the state. Um, Long years of conflict has created multiplicity of national, regional, and global players. And now we've got four categories of players: regional countries, key among them Pakistan, and now to some extent Qatar as well. Regional non state actors, Taliban, Al Qaeda, Daesh, etc. Big powers, US, NATO, China, Russian Federation, although China and Russia are among the regional countries too. And then we have the national players, the palace in Kabul, the High Council for National Reconciliation, the parliament, political parties, political heavyweights, media, civil society, private sector that have flourished in the past 20 years. Given the complexity of relations between the players, coordination among them is a key word. It's a little bit like collecting frogs in a bucket. When you have one of them, the other one jumps. Ideal scenario would have been Afghanistan itself a good coordinator. On the surface, at least, we call Afghanistan, we call it Afghan-led and Afghan-owned process. But are we really leading and are we really owning? US Envoy Ambassador Khalilzad appears to be doing some coordination, but we all know that he doesn't have all on board. We all know that, for example, Iran is not on board. But at the moment, we're talking about four key players: Pakistan, Taliban, the United States, and Afghanistan. What are the troubles that Ashok mentioned at the beginning? What are the troubles with the US-Taliban agreement signed 8 months ago? The agreement might have been an agreement for safe US withdrawal, bringing the Taliban and the state delegation of Afghanistan face to face, but it emboldened the Taliban and their regional supporters and raised their morale in conquering the rest of the country. So far in Doha, we're stuck with the rules of procedure while the fighting inside the country continues. To what extent the fighting has linkages to the talks in Doha, it needs verification. We've also seen some signs of cracks among members of the Taliban delegation. In Kabul, the domestic politics is not that rosy either. The agreement undermined legitimacy and governance in Afghanistan, as if we didn't have enough domestic troubles. The agreement sent out the wrong messages to the extremist groups in our region and around the world. According to the UN monitoring team, Al Qaeda is still heavily embedded within the Taliban. The agreement amounted to a de facto recognition of the Taliban administration and the territory that they control, a clear challenge to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. The agreement created a leverage point for the Taliban and their regional supporters to hold President Trump's re-election campaign to ransom and win more concessions before the election. The agreement makes no reference whatsoever to the regional dimensions of the conflict, nor it mentions the disarmament of the Taliban. It briefly mentions that a permanent ceasefire will be an item in the agenda of the inter-Afghan negotiations. Few unprecedented things have happened in this peace process. We've seen the release of 6,100 Taliban prisoners in return for 1,000 government prisoners prior to the start of any negotiations. And of course, we've seen the discussion over the rules of procedure now for a month and 3 weeks, and there is very little progress in that. What is likely to happen? The finalization of the rules of procedure will probably go well beyond 3rd of November, which is next week, the US presidential election, unless President Trump wants to use it as his campaign trump card in the next couple of days. Certainly, the outcome of the US election will have an impact on the negotiations. Putting together the agenda will probably take a lot more time. Meanwhile, the Taliban violence inside the country and the encircling of major cities is in full gear, probably until the end of autumn. It will continue with a shift in winter to targeted terrorist attacks in urban areas, then back to spring offensive until May 2021, when we see the completion of US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. Under the agreement, two other processes should be underway. One is administrative review of current US sanctions on the and the rewards list against members of the Taliban, and the other one is US diplomatic engagement with UN Security Council members and Afghanistan to remove members of the Taliban from the sanctions list. Progress in these two processes are not subject to progress in negotiations. The next Taliban move would be to demand for cut of financial aid to the Afghan security forces. Given the performance of the Taliban and their regional supporters in the past 25 years, the possibility of using or abusing the peace process for further advancing their political recognition and visibility is high. What can India do? India can work with regional countries, convincing them that their short-term gains by playing with Taliban as an instrument of rivalry with the US will come back to haunt them. Make sure they believe that the Taliban believe in peace. India can work on establishment of an official trilateral dialogue between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India to keep the Pakistan-India tension away from Afghanistan. And this dialogue could be independent from the composite dialogue and other bilateral mechanisms between India and Pakistan. We've seen already they attract two trilateral dialogue, but I think the time has come that we focus on official trilateral dialogue. India can continue to remain engaged in the political and economic development of Afghanistan. Our young generation is the fruit of the course of democratization in the country. They will stand up to the Taliban if the talks fail. There is absolutely no way that Afghans will give up to the tyranny of the Taliban. Unfortunately, this will serve the interest of those who want Afghanistan weak, but I don't think Afghans will give up to the Taliban. Keep an eye on the collective gains we have made in the past 20 years, especially the ones enjoying Indian support. In the course of further weakening the state and hurting our relations, the Taliban may continue targeting those projects. In the wider region, the policy of looking east might have profited India, but don't forget that the peace of Afghanistan may be the gate to the profitable looking west policy of India as well. The Indo-Pacific security architecture is important. The heart of Asia's security architecture should be as important. The domestic policies of India have regional impact. Whatever policies you adopt, make sure you think about its regional dimensions. An advice to my own capital, Kabul and Islamabad: work on addressing the root causes of the conflict. Establish an official permanent joint special commission between Afghanistan and Pakistan to study past and existing grievances, determine the root causes of trust deficit between the two countries, and address them one by one on prioritization and practicality basis. Allow the course of democratization to flourish in both countries. With plausible deniability, you may win the moment or the day, but you will have no credibility among the nations in the long term. One advice for the US, and I finish with that: whoever wins next week's election, make sure you have a proactive and creative regional diplomacy for our part of the world and diffuse the tensions as much as you can. Otherwise, Afghanistan will suffer a lot. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Saikal. We couldn't have asked for a more comprehensive um, account of the Afghanistan peace process and the prescriptions, or rather the advice that you have suggested for from Kabul to New Delhi to Washington to Taliban. I think that's an excellent synopsis of the peace process, the direction it is going, and last of all, the extraordinary concessions that have been made by the US to the Taliban, which Kabul has had to accept. Thank you, Ambassador Saikal. Our next speaker is Ambassador Rakesh Sood. Ambassador Rakesh Sood has been an ambassador in Kabul as well as an ambassador in Nepal. Ambassador Sood is a prolific writer. He's a disarmament expert. And when the disarmament, demobilization of the Taliban figures, I'm sure his advice will be sought. Ambassador Sood was an advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh on disarmament. Rakesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, General Mehta. And let me also thank the India International Center and you particularly for giving me this opportunity to speak on a subject which is very close to my heart. And let me also say what a pleasure it is to have this interaction with my old friend, Ambassador Saikal, although this is a virtual interaction, but it is wonderful to see you. And Ambassador Saikal, I think let me endorse what General Mehta said. I think you gave us a wonderful, wonderful introduction to the dilemmas that face Afghanistan today. I always believe that in this kind of a setting where we are talking to people who we should try and be as simple and as direct and as candid as possible. I think we should call a spade a spade. So let me first of all start by saying that what was signed between US and Taliban on 29th of February 2020 was not a peace agreement. It was a US withdrawal agreement. And I think we should call it as such. For those of us who have followed these negotiations since the time of Ambassador Khalilzad's appointment by US government as a special representative, it was quite clear that there were four issues. In fact, Ambassador Khalilzad made it a point to say that there are four subjects that we are discussing. One is the US withdrawal, a second is a ceasefire, a third is the cutting of ties of the Taliban with the terrorist groups like Al Qaeda, and the fourth is an intra Afghan dialogue. And he made it a point of saying that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. Somewhere along the way, the priorities changed. Now, this is understandable. The US is a sovereign country and its priorities changed to getting its own soldiers back home and withdrawal. And that was also the priority for the Taliban. So what happened is that what was agreed is some kind of assurance that the Taliban will actually cut their ties with international terrorist groups and they will not attack the US forces and the US will withdraw its soldiers. And they gave a timeline by it has already come down from the earlier figure to about 8,500 now. And President Trump has already tweeted that he would like to see all of them back home by Christmas. And even if that doesn't happen, the timeline is that by next April, they should all be back home. Meanwhile, insofar as the cutting of ties is concerned, I think just yesterday, Edmund Fitton Brown, the coordinator of the United Nations for Islamic State, Al Qaeda, and Taliban monitoring team, he said in an interview, and I quote here, he said, the Taliban promised Al Qaeda in the run up to the US agreement. The Taliban promised to the Al Qaeda in the run up to the US agreement that the two groups would remain allies. And he says further that the Taliban have been talking regularly and at high levels with the Al Qaeda and reassuring them that they would honor their historic ties. He also said that this relationship has not changed substantively since the deal with the United States. And I think the proof of that is quite clear in the rising levels of violence that we have seen in Afghanistan. So I think that is point number one. The second point is that the major powers, and I think Ambassador Saikal provided a very good summary in terms of the major powers, the regional powers, and so on. The tragedy is that the major powers are divided. The US objective is to seek an early withdrawal, to manage its exit from Afghanistan. The Russians would like to ensure that they become a player once again in Afghanistan. The Chinese have their own security interests vis-a-vis the Uyghur Muslims and linkages there, and so they want to ensure that it does not spill over there. And so all three major powers have divergent interests. And further, the relationship between the major powers today is one that is colored by mistrust, acute mistrust. In fact, the US in its new security strategy describes Russia as a disruptive power, describes China as a revisionist power, and so on. The regional powers clearly are divided in terms of how they see a future for Afghanistan. Now, given divisions among the regional powers like India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asian countries, Iran, etc., and given the divergences among the major powers, it is hardly surprising that we see internal differences within Afghanistan as well as to what are the terms. Now, I fully understand that with decades and decades of fighting and violence, 100% of the Afghans form a peace constituency. 100% of the Afghans actually want peace. But on what terms? On what conditions? And I think this is where the difference is. So we come back to what is perhaps my third point, which is the myth of an Afghan led, Afghan owned, Afghan controlled peace process. Now, for the last 9 or 10 years, India has said that we support an Afghan led, Afghan owned, and Afghan controlled peace process. But the reality is that A, it is not a peace process, and B, whatever is happening is not Afghan led or Afghan owned. And as I mentioned earlier, the different players in Afghanistan are actually internally divided. So, therefore, what we are seeing is a gradual unraveling. And I think that is perhaps the biggest risk that we have. My final comment is with regard to the role for India. Because, as I mentioned earlier, for the last 9 years, since 2011, we've been talking about our support for an Afghan led, Afghan owned, and Afghan controlled process. Now, I think this mantra took on a certain amount of life of its own. And even when we saw that the process was actually being shaped and being controlled by other players, whether it was Pakistan, whether it was Taliban, whether it was US domestic interests or European interests or whatever, I think we continue to sort of formally talk about it. And in that process, we just found comfort in that kind of a mantra. I think what we are seeing now is that finally we've realized that we can't have it both ways. I mean, we can't say that we want to be part of the process. I mean, and then not be engaged. It's like saying that I want to be invited to the dance, I want to be invited to the party, but once I go there, I'm going to sit by the side and I'm not going to get up to dance. Now, sooner or later, people will stop inviting you to the party. It's a question of what you bring to the party. So, I think what we have seen in the recent visits whether by Dr. Abdullah, who was here following before that, General Dostum was here. More recently, we saw Governor Ata Muhammad Noor here, all important political figures. As you know, Dr. Abdullah is also the chairman of the High Peace Council. So, and all of them have urged India to play a more active role. And that requires engaging a little more deeply. Now, also, let me put it very clearly, India has certain limitations. We don't share a border with Afghanistan. So, in a sense, it is in our power to do good for Afghanistan. Our ability, perhaps, to do harm to Afghanistan is limited. And maybe that is a good thing. And that is one reason why we have been accepted as perhaps among the most preferred development partners for Afghanistan. And I think that is what we need to capitalize on. But we also need to be able to engage with all the potential players so that we are not just seen as engaged, but are actually engaged in terms of keeping our relationships with all groups in Afghanistan valid and active. I think we are going to see turbulence in Afghanistan for the simple reason that, irrespective of who wins the US election on 3rd November, um, the US patience, as it were, has run out. In a sense, there is a general fatigue that is there. And so, therefore, we will see a gradual Western withdrawal. And that means that the regional players will have to willy nilly play a greater role in terms of ensuring what I hope will be a peaceful outcome. I think it is important here to remember that India's vision for Afghan future is that of a stable, independent, autonomous Afghanistan where all ethnic groups can coexist and prosper. Now, and I think that given my experience, this is also a vision for Afghanistan that the vast majority of the Afghan population shares. The question is, which we need to ask ourselves is, how many of the other regional players share that vision for Afghanistan? Thank you.
Mr. Sood, I will try to sum up what you said in reference to saving time, but I will advise members in the audience to put in their questions in the chat box. Questions for the two panelists, please put them in the chat box. The third speaker is myself, and I will briefly speak about the Afghanistan peace process, which may prove or is already proving to be the most complex and intractable processes, as all of them appear to be at the start. In Afghanistan, though, there is a strategic stalemate at present. At the tactical level, things are changing constantly, and this is due to the fact that the balance of the military advantage is with the Taliban, aided and abetted by Pakistan, where in Pakistan, Taliban has its sanctuaries and sources of succor. Why the US did not hit and end safe havens in Pakistan is a big mystery, among other mysteries, as part of this peace process. Taliban's trump card, and there is no pun intended here, is its capacity for violence, sustaining it with undiminishing platoons of suicide bombers and plentiful resources provided by Pakistan. It is a brutal and savage terrorist entity with its affiliates, as we've been told by the other two speakers. While it has stopped attacking foreign forces, its violence is now directed against fellow Afghans. Annually, 10,000 Afghans on an average lose life or limb. But this year, after signing of the reconciliation agreement, on an average day, 30 ground assaults and remotely controlled bombings take place on an average in 14 of the 34 provinces. Now, that's a huge, big figure of casualties. The figures of casualties since 29th February, when the peace deal was signed, Till 31st July, those figures were 4,000 killed and 15,000 wounded. Roland Kobia, the EU envoy for Afghanistan, citing UN figures, reported that in the run up to the peace agreement, that is the actual peace talks starting on 12th September, in those last 5 weeks, violence levels were higher than at any time in the last 5 years. The Taliban has shown its ability and willingness to control violence when it wants to during the two Eid ceasefires. Many in the Taliban believe that this war is winnable and that once foreign forces leave and the Afghanistan National Security Forces will capitulate and it will return to the 1996 era. The Taliban has to be convinced, and this is important, the Taliban has to be convinced there is more to gain from the peace process than on the battlefield through a civil war. And, and this applies to its gains both politically and in terms of reconciliation and rehabilitation. The study of peace processes across the world reveals, and the peace process, like in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, in South Africa, the Maoist revolt in Nepal, the Havana process in Colombia, they all show that patience and perseverance are key to conflict resolution, and and these are possible when the terms of peace are acceptable to both sides. Earlier this month, the principal players of the Havana peace process discussed the key lessons from the 5 decade long conflict in Colombia and their relevance to Afghanistan peace process. Sergio Jaramillo, the Deputy Defense Minister of Colombia, pointed out that as far as Afghanistan was concerned, the major difference between what happened in Colombia and Afghanistan is about the military imbalance and the absence of a ceasefire. In Colombia, a ceasefire was upfront or nearly upfront, and the military balance was almost equal, unlike in Afghanistan. Incidentally, there are lessons to be learned from peace processes that have not worked so far, like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and others. I will end by citing two books that are repository of the nitty-gritty of conflict resolution, if you like, the A to Z of conflict resolution. And these are the books, The Working Together to Change the Future by Adam Kahane. And the second book is titled How Enemies Become Friends by Charles Kuppan. No peace process can work without an umpire and a referee. The Afghanistan peace process does not, at the moment, have a referee or a neutral negotiator acceptable to both sides. All peace processes have had one. But as Ambassador Saikal told us, that the peace process in Afghanistan is still grounded and is yet to take off and may probably do after 3rd November. The Norwegians have excelled themselves as neutral negotiators, and who knows, maybe the Norwegians may be asked to step in as as negotiators. I will stop here And this ends the process of our three speakers speaking, and we will start the Q&A, and I will take advantage as a moderator to start this process by asking Ambassador Saikal that in hindsight, would it have been possible for the US to have struck the agreement with the Taliban alongside, in other words, in consultation with the Kabul government? As you said, that the concessions that were made, the release of prisoners, the putting the ceasefire as part of the final settlement, these concessions are extraordinary. And I would also like, for the benefit of our audience, to listen to what the title of this agreement was between the US and Taliban. It was called an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by United States as a state and is known as Taliban, and the USA. The Taliban and the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network has a bounty of $10 million by the US. The Taliban is a proscribed United Nations terrorist group. So, given all this, Ambassador Saikal, do you think that the Kabul government should have been consulted on the peace process? Or was it consulted?
Well, ideally, the Lisbon summit of NATO in 2010 put the roadwork together for the withdrawal of international forces. And that went really well until the end of 2014. We saw the withdrawal of 120, 130,000 troops from Afghanistan. And by the end of 2014, there was only 10,000. It would have been nice to work with that roadmap. The question was that, or the trouble was that that roadmap was put together by the Obama administration, and President Trump didn't like that. He wanted to initiate something of his own. The point is, it was as the withdrawal happened after 2010. There was a deliberate push by the Taliban to make sure that the withdrawal doesn't finish peacefully, to make sure that they gain the credit of the US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. And this is something that shouldn't have been given to them. We should have insisted on the roadmap of the Lisbon Summit of NATO of 2010. But anyway, one suggestion was from our side to make sure that it's a trilateral approach to this, and then also the choreography of how it's being signed to make sure that it's not a superpower negotiating with a terrorist group and reaching an agreement and giving all those credits to the Taliban. I think this was brought to the attention of the US and also to the regional countries, including India, by some of us. But unfortunately, it didn't work. And eventually, the Taliban and their supporters got what they wanted. The agreement is very much a withdrawal agreement. It doesn't have a lot to do with the peace of Afghanistan. It does have a reference to the fact that ceasefire will be an item of discussion in the agenda of the inter-Afghan negotiations. Beyond that, everything else is about the safety of the US forces to leave Afghanistan and to make sure that the Taliban don't cause trouble. The point is that the number of US troops that we're talking about is very small. We're not talking of 120,000 Red Army of the Soviet Union leaving Afghanistan in the years 1988 and 1989. we're talking of a small number, but I think we've blown it out of proportion, and it looks like the Taliban needed that in order to for the moral boost and in order to get more supporters to come and support and to their fighting. To convince everybody that they are the ones who have been instrumental in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you,
My
Ambassador.
feeling is that Ambassador Khalilzad was under pressure from the US election to make a delivery long before the 3rd of November, and therefore he pushed it.
Right, right. Ambassador Saikal, another question for you is in relation to the Chabahar port. Only yesterday, there was a meeting between India and the Central Asian republics. And in this meeting, the question of use of the Chabahar port, as well as India giving a line of credit to the Central Asian Republic countries of $1 billion for connectivity projects. I know you have visited Chabahar, and I know that you have studied Chabahar and its implications for connectivity and development of Afghanistan and Central Asia. So, what are your views on the utility of Chabahar port, and what is its actual day-to-day contribution to Afghanistan in the trade between India and Afghanistan and the passage through Afghanistan through the Central Asian republics via Chabahar port?
Well, technically speaking, there's no doubt that Chabahar is the closest port to Afghanistan, and also a study of the World Bank, I think it was in 2004, shows clearly that the cheapest way to trade is for the Central Asian republics, especially for the Central Asian capitals, is to go through Chabahar, especially when it comes to railway transportation. But politically speaking, I think we've seen a recent development, and that is the strategic partnership between China and Iran. Coming to the confrontation, the increase in tension between Iran and the United States, it looks like Iran has been looking around and has struck a deal with China, and this brings China closer to Iran. Now it depends very much on the relationship or bilateral relationship between India and China, and also the trilateral relationship between China, India, and Iran, and to what extent there is a dialogue going there. But I think Chabahar is a port of importance to us, and we have tested the importance of it, and we've seen things working, but I think there's a lot more work to be done. We need to work on it politically, and we need to work on it technically. Of course, there was a concession from the US as well when it came to Chabahar to make sure that the Iran is not under sanctions when it comes to Chabahar. But it looks like although the agreement was announced, but technically on the ground, still there are problems, and some of the banks of Iran cannot operate because of the US sanctions, and that creates problems for the use of Chabahar.
Thank you, Ambassador Saikal. Ambassador Sood, a question for you. You mentioned, in fact, throughout your presentation, your main point was why is it that India, which has been talking about Afghan-owned, Afghan-led, Afghan-driven peace process, and that one of the principal players of this peace process is the Taliban. What do you think is holding back India from engaging the Taliban?
Well, I think that the um, India has had, as the listeners and viewers would know, a difficult relationship with the Taliban. Um, we had the IC-814 hijacking from Kathmandu, which ended up in Kandahar, and I think that has left a very negative sentiment about the Taliban. I think it was also that during the Taliban period was when we closed down our embassy in Kabul in the in 1996, and we didn't have a presence there till we re-established it after the Taliban had been removed from Afghanistan. Uh, that also coincided with the time when we had a lot of growth in insurgency in Kashmir. So I think all in all, there is a certain historical baggage. However, I think what we need to understand is that since that time, we have built our own equations. We have, as Ambassador Saikal pointed out, we have put in nearly $3 billion in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of capacity building, infrastructure restoration, and so on in Afghanistan, cutting across provincial boundaries, cutting across any ethnic divisions in Afghanistan, and so on. And I think we should therefore be able to develop a dialogue with much greater sense of confidence than perhaps has been evident in recent years. That is the only reason that I can think of it. Perhaps the other reason would be that since we felt that we wanted it to be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled process, we didn't want to get ahead of the government. But I think it was quite clear to us that the government in Kabul was internally divided. It was not a unified government. We saw the outcome of the elections, both in 2014 and in 2019, was a highly contested outcome. And so we saw internal divisions in Afghanistan. Or perhaps we felt that therefore the political bandwidth was focused on certain other relationships. And as a result, we just, in a sense, found it comfortable to lapse into some kind of an inertial approach in not engaging with all the players, despite the fact that at one level we kept insisting that we have a role to play in the future of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Rakesh. In fact, I recall at a Raisina dialogue about 3 years ago, General Rawat, who was then the Chief of Army Staff, was asked by the anchor of that particular program and session that if India was prepared to talk to separatist groups in Kashmir, why was it not in a position to talk to the Taliban in Afghanistan? And she asked General Rawat whether he would recommend to his government that they should talk to Taliban, and he said yes, we should talk to Taliban. But I think this is another mystery that lasts. There's a question from Mr. DC Pathak, and both, I think, Rakesh, you can have a crack at this. Is the US completely with India on the stand that Afghanistan could be an inclusive Islamic republic, but not an Afghan emirate of the 1996 kind? I'm not sure what he means by completely with India. But Rakesh, would you like to have a crack at this?
Um, Jameda, my view is that the US primary interest is to ensure a managed withdrawal from Afghanistan. As long as they can withdraw and the situation remains stable, at least for a certain period of time. In fact, this was precisely the kind of thing that happened. Kissinger writes about it as to how he fooled the rest of the world into thinking that they had brought peace to Vietnam. And I'm talking of 1970s, whereas actually in his own diary, he was talking and telling the Chinese that all we want is about 18 months, and after 18 months, if Saigon falls, it'll be all right. So 18 months was seen as a respectable period. Now, with social media and distractions, 24/7 news channels, I'm sure a respectable period may even be much shorter. So I think that the US will talk about the need for an inclusive Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, because I'm sure that nobody wants to see the gains of the last 19 years lost. Certainly not the Afghan population, but ultimately it will depend on the Afghan population as to whether how much of the gains of the constitution, how much of the fundamental human rights that are enshrined in the new Afghan constitution are they able to retain in this negotiation in Doha, which so far doesn't seem to be getting very far.
We have another question and this question is from Mr. Sachdeva in Vienna. And he is asking, what are the possibilities of an international peace force drawn from countries not having any borders with Afghanistan, but funded entirely by countries having borders with Afghanistan? Um, Ambassador Saikal, you're smiling. Would you like to take a shot at this?
Well, I think this has gone too far. But before I come to this, let me just comment on what Ambassador Sood said earlier about the divided Afghanistan, the division inside Afghanistan. You see, at the beginning, I said at the beginning of my presentation that the country has seen 10 years of Soviet occupation and then the constant meddling from Pakistan and then the gradual even invasion from Pakistan and the proxy wars and all that. So they each have proxies. And, we shouldn't forget that the Red Army has spent a fortune training mercenaries in the south, using them in the north of Afghanistan, and making mercenaries in the north and using them in the south, and also pushing the ethnic line and ethnic divides and so on in order to divide and rule. And then we saw in the 1990s the same kind of techniques being used by our southern neighbor. So as a result of that, no doubt that we do have division and no doubt that we do have mercenaries and so on. But at the same time, the people of Afghanistan, there is a strong force inside the country that work for the integrity of Afghanistan, for the freedom of Afghanistan, making sure that we do become a peaceful country and a platform of cordiality for the region and those beyond the region, and make sure that we are a friend of all. But on the issue, on this question of Mr. Eva from Vienna, what are the possibilities of international peace force? I think at this stage we need to give some time to see where this so-called inter-Afghan negotiation leads to. I think the fact that they have come face to face, it's an achievement. The fact that they have been talking, although they haven't made any progress in the rules of procedure, which is very basic thing. My feeling is that after the 3rd of November election in the US, things may change. So we need to give a chance. I think 1.5 months is not a long time. So let's give it a chance and see what happens and see what kind of flexibility the Taliban show. But it is important that all of us, regional countries, in particular India, we work and make sure that the Taliban believe in peace, that the Taliban believe that there is no way they can win through fighting. This is 100% sure. There is no way that the Taliban can win this war in Afghanistan, regardless of whether the US is in Afghanistan or not, because we've proven in the past, between 1996 and 2001, there was no one in Afghanistan. It was our own people fighting the Taliban and keeping them at bay, by the way. I mean, we were doing a much better job, sometimes better than NATO does. So I think this should be reminded to the Taliban and to their supporters that they cannot win militarily. But yes, if they want to keep Afghanistan weak, if that is the policy, that will keep us weak. That will keep us bleeding. But in the long run, it will not be in the interest of anybody in the region to keep Afghanistan bleeding. So I think it is an opportunity at the same time right now to make sure that there is a breakthrough in this negotiation in Doha, and make sure that we come up with the rules of procedure very soon, and we put an agenda together, and we really focus on the ceasefire, because that is, the ultimate call of Afghanistan, of the region, most of the countries of the region, and around the world. I think 90% of the countries on the surface, even the 10% which doesn't on the surface, they say that they believe that a ceasefire should come into effect as soon as possible. I think that's what we need to work on, because as we speak, there are people dying in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador Saikal. You will remember that when the two of us were working on the project, the regional approach to Afghanistan, the role of regional players, and we were in New York and we met up with the United Nations peacekeeping people. And this question about an international or a regional peacekeeping force had come up then. And the United Nations rep who was interacting with us had said that it was too early to think of a peacekeeping force in the area. But they said that they would have contingency plans for such an eventuality. Now we've crossed our time, but we can still take one last question, and this question is from Mr. Upendra Baghel, and it is a question for Ambassador Sood. He's asking how much India's policy towards Afghanistan is influenced by her security concerns from Pakistan. If it is too much, then whether it could be reduced, if not fully delinked. I didn't understand the latter part, but the former is very clear. Uh, that is the proxy war between Afghanistan and between Pakistan and India and Afghanistan. Master Sood?
Well, I think that to an extent, this was perhaps the situation in the 1990s, because the Taliban, which started emerging in 1994, and by 1996 they had taken over Kabul and they had taken over large parts of Afghanistan. At that time, the resistance to the Taliban came from the Northern Alliance. Now, India, Russia, and Iran were closely aligned and supporting the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban. The Taliban were strongly supported by Pakistan. In fact, the Taliban only enjoyed diplomatic recognition from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, just three countries in the world. And I would say that that is the time when we had this kind of a situation. I think once the Taliban left, after 9/11, once the Americans came in, the international community got engaged. I think what we did was we actually enlarged our engagement in Afghanistan. And we no longer made it an issue of India-Pakistan rivalry. Because in our assistance program, in our reconstruction program, in our assistance projects that we did, in the scholarships that we gave for Afghan students, for capacity development, for human resource development, we cut across all possible divisions. Every single province of Afghanistan was covered and touched by these projects. And we wanted to make sure that we were seen as a credible partner which was not playing favorites in Afghanistan. And I think, so we wanted to take it beyond that. Now, unfortunately, Pakistan has continued to see its relationship with Afghanistan through the India prism. And I have said this in my talks with my Pakistani counterparts at times, that now Pakistan's relationship with India is mired in hostility and mistrust. And that is a long-standing issue. However, if they continue to look at their relationship with Afghanistan through the India prism, then I am afraid they are doomed to have a hostile relationship with Afghanistan. It is up to them to figure out whether they want to look at their relationship with Afghanistan through the India prism, or whether they want to also contribute to the idea of an autonomous, independent, and peaceful and stable Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Ladies and gentlemen, you will agree that we've had an excellent discussion, and Ambassador Saikal has given us a very comprehensive overview of the state of the Afghanistan peace process. One hopes that violence will end soon because the people of Afghanistan have suffered and suffered violence, death, and destruction. And we must hope that after 3rd November, as Ambassador Saikal hopes, that the ground rules can be framed and the actual face to face talks can take place. And at some time very soon, that the ceasefire, or at least a major reduction in violence, can take place in Afghanistan. Because if that doesn't happen, the misery of the Afghanistan, of the Afghans, will continue. India must engage the Taliban. I think this cannot be said in any stronger terms. And India must punch up to its weight and convert the goodwill it enjoys amongst the Afghans into some sort of political usable influence. Well, that's all for now. On behalf of the India International Center, let me thank Ambassador Saikal and Ambassador Sood for their contribution. Next month, on 27th November, we will come back with the Neighbourhood series with another country. Till then, for the Indians, happy Diwali, remain safe and secure, and goodbye.
Goodbye
Goodbye.
and happy
Thank
Diwali to
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.